and using the wrong rod. You don't want something too stiff. You don't want something too parabolic. You still want a little bit of backbone to drive that hook, but you also want a parabolic rod, something that's somewhat whippy to really absorb all them head shakes, help with breaking the line. And again, that parabolic bend mixed with that little bit of backbone in the rod really helps tire them out and get them in the boat. Why do we lose smallmouth? Drag too tight. Again, these are things that I just feel like they're not talked about too much. And there's still times where I'm like, shoot, my drag was 2 clicks too tight. Snapping your line when they jump. When they jump, that's when it's the scariest. Typically when I'm fishing for smallmouth, my drag will be on the tighter end for when I set the hook. But second I set the hook and I know that fish is pinned, I will loosen it way off. But you also don't want to loosen it off too much, because then you're not gonna get a good hook penetration in the fish's mouth. So there's a really fine line, but typically how I look at it is, so when I set the hook, I want my rod completely double over. So I want the power of that rod doing all the work. And when I do set the hook, it's more of a feel, reel into them, feel the weight and lean. And again, let the power, let the action of the rod do all the work and make that hook penetrate into the fish's mouth. So again, something I feel like is quite often overlooked, and that's the barb. You know, and I overlooked it for years. I really didn't start paying attention to a barb on a hook until about 2-3 years ago. And again, something super overlooked, but it's so important. At the end of the day, when you hook a smallmouth, you know, their mouths are so hard, but when you hook a smallmouth and they start jumping, having a good barb is so important, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's keeping that hook in the fish's mouth is the barb. So here's a picture of 2 barbs. The first one, as you can see, is a lot smaller than the second one. Second one looks a little bit aggressive just because it's a blown up photo, but that second one is kind of the barb that I look for. Something that's a little bit bigger, but you also don't want too big of a barb, because the bigger the barb, it's a little bit harder to penetrate. So you want one that's kind of in between, not too small, not too big. But again, something I just think's overlooked that is, in my opinion, one of the most important thing when you're choosing the right drop shot hook. Again, setting the drag, we kind of already touched on this, but super important. Drag is everything. Going back to the reel, I throw the Vanford. It's got the Duracross drag, just silky smooth. And again, when I set the hook, it's not super loose. It's on the tighter side. Second I know that hook's in the fish's mouth, I loosen my drag way off. Especially if I know they're skin hooked, I will loosen it way off. There's sometimes I'll take 20 minutes to bring a 5-pounder into the boat. But at the end of the day, it could be the difference of getting a big one in the boat or not. So really pay attention, see if they're skin hooked. They get skin hooked a lot. It's weird. It's almost like they know. Like I said, they'll do those weird head shakes. Remember that for next time you're out. 8 times out of 10, it's because they're skin hooked, is when they do those weird head shakes and loosen your drag way off. Again, we went over setting the hook. I want that power of the rod to do the work. I'm not setting the hook. It's more of a reel. Make sure he's there. Let your rod load up a little bit and then just lean. Let the power of the rod do the work. They're thin wired hooks. It does not take much for that thin wired hook to get in the fish's mouth. They're so thin, it's like putting a needle in our arm. Goes in super easily. But again, the barb is very important. You want a good barb, because once that hook gets in, the only thing that's keeping that hook in is the barb. So matching the hatch is not always the answer. Again, something that you're like, what do you mean? And it's the answer a lot of the time. You know, we're fishing for fish out in Lake Ontario, they eat gobies. We're going to want to throw something that looks like a goby. Then you look at someone like Taku, and he's throwing dice that look nothing like anything in the water. So smallmouth are curious. So don't be afraid to throw something that doesn't look like anything in the water column. They're such curious creatures. You know, like I was talking about earlier, how I used to drop the camera a lot in the St. Lawrence River, and these smallmouth, they'll follow the camera for 2 miles down the river. It's crazy. They're just so curious. So just keep that in mind next time you guys are out in the water. You know, these smallmouth are getting so pressured. Matching the hatch is not always the answer. It is a lot of time, but just show them something different. That's what I'm getting at. Show them something different. Try and find something that they've never seen. And if you can find something that they've never seen, almost 8 times out of 10, they're gonna bite. Again, they're curious, they wanna see what it is. So just keep that in mind. So when it comes to where to throw a drop shot, you can throw a drop shot wherever, whenever, any time of year. I mean, to a certain extent, you can't throw a size 2 drop shot hook in a mat, but you can throw it around grass, you can throw it up shallow on shallow sand, you can throw it out in 50, 60 feet of water. And again, going back to the whole versatility of a drop shot, you can do it so many different ways. That's why I love it so much, so versatile. But when it comes to where to throw it, it really depends on what body of water you're at. So Lake St. Clair, for example, I'm using Lake St. Clair and the St. Lawrence for examples, just because those were the last 2 northerns I fished last year on the elites. Lake St. Clair sets up completely different from Lake Ontario. So on Lake St. Clair, you got weed and you got sand and you have some rock by the Detroit River. But again, every lake's different. And when it comes to smallmouth fishing, any type of fishing, irregularities. That is number one. You need to find irregularities. So on St. Clair, like I said, you have some rock, you have sand, and you have weed. So that irregular, and smallmouth get on all 3 of those things. But it depends on how those things set up. So if you have a big football field full of weed, you're probably going to want to find rock because there's so much weed. You want to find something that's different. If you have a giant flat that's sand, you're going to want to find maybe a clump of weed. So just finding irregularities is the most important thing when it comes to fishing for smallmouth. Lake Ontario, they relate to sand, rock. They relate to weed as well, but there's definitely not as much weed on Lake Ontario as there is Lake St. Clair. But irregularities is everything. And again,